G'day, this is Chris Savage from Ariel Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the life of Messiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you as you grow in the grace and knowledge of our Saviour Jesus Christ. Thank you. We're looking at the rest of his trial and the crucifixion. That's paragraphs 174 to 177 in your harmony. Okay, last week we looked at the denial by Peter. And we saw the progression of that denial. It went from just a simple denial to denial with an oath. And then the last denial was with swearing and cursing Jesus himself. We saw the condemnation by the Sanhedrin last week, and they charged Jesus with blasphemy because he said that I am the Son of God. I mean, they got to find a reason to charge him, even though that wasn't actually blasphemy. We saw the death of Judas, and we spoke about the fact that he wasn't a saved individual. He was just sorry for what he did, not sorry in a repentant salvation sense. We also sorted out that seeming contradiction. Judas died by hanging himself, but because it was Passover, they had to clear the dead out of Jerusalem, so they pulled him down, chucked him over the wall, and his bowels gushed forth. So they had to cleanse the city prior to Passover. We saw also that because the Sanhedrin couldn't take the money that he gave them back because it was classed as blood money, because of bribery money, so they bought a field for Judas because it was his money, and they bought it and it was put into his name because that was the requirement. And also with that, buying that field, which is called the field of blood or Akeldama, we did see that they also, where the field was, is in the place called Topheth, which carries with it a curse from Jeremiah. The curse was that there would be so many dead bodies there that it would be overflowing with dead bodies. And certainly we will see later, well, we knew from later on in AD 70, that's exactly what happened. They ran out of space to bury the dead in the valley of Topheth. We see Jesus coming before in the civil trial, first before Pilate. One of the things with the Romans, it had to be public, and the accuser had to come forth with the charge. Well, Judas is dead, so he couldn't come forth with the charge. So therefore, no accuser, no charge, no condemnation. So what the Sanhedrin had to do was come up with another charge very quickly, and which they did. They now came up with a charge of sedition against Rome, which is actually punishable by death on the Roman law. So Pilate then examines Jesus, and he finds no charge against him. He's totally innocent. He's not a competitor to Caesar, because he says, my kingdom is not from here. So he now sends Jesus on to Herod, who is the ruler of Galilee, simply because Jesus comes from Galilee. So he says, listen, I'll pass the ball. Passes Jesus to Herod. Herod examines him, and he has no charge against him, so now he declares Jesus innocent. So tonight we are now looking at the second trial before Pilate, and this is covered by Matthew 27:15 to 26, Mark 15:6 to 15, Luke 23:13 to 25, and John 18:39 to 19:16. Now, in this last stage of the civil trial, there's going to be several attempts by Pilate to have Jesus released. And the first attempt is given in the Luke account in Luke 23, verses 14 to 15, where Pilate presented Jesus before the people, and he pointed out that Herod Antipas had not found any reason or any basis for conviction, and neither had he. So in Luke 23:14 to 15, he says, you brought unto me this man as one that perverteth the people. And behold, I, having examined him before you, found no fault in this man touching those things whereof you accuse him. No, nor yet Herod, for he sent him back unto us, and behold, nothing worthy of death has been done by him. So this would have been Pilate's third declaration of innocence and Herod's second declaration of innocence. And in his second attempt to have Jesus released, he offered to the people a choice between Jesus and a man called Barabbas. And in John chapter 18, verse 30, Pilate is quoted as saying, "But you have a custom that I should release unto you one at the Passover. Will you therefore that I release unto you the King of the Jews?" Now, this custom had developed that during the Passover, the Roman authorities would release one Jewish prisoner as a goodwill gesture. Now, who Barabbas was comes out in the Mark account in Mark chapter 15, verse 7. "And there was one called Barabbas, lying bound with them that had made insurrection, men who in the insurrection had committed murder." So here we should note, and again, here's the irony again here, is that Barabbas was guilty of the very crime which Jesus was being accused of in the civil trial. And that was sedition against Rome, insurrection against Rome. Because remember, that's what the Sanhedrin came up with, because sedition carries with the death penalty. Now, Luke 23, verse 19, confirms that Barabbas led a rebellion or uprising and committed murder. That's the reason he was thrown into prison. Now, the irony goes even further. Now, the Gospels do not give his proper name, simply because it probably would have been very confusing for you to be reading it. But we know from secular sources that the full name of Barabbas was Jesus Bar Abbas. And that name means Jesus, Son of the Father. So there was a man in prison who was guilty of the very crime that Jesus, the Messiah, was accused of. And his full name was Jesus, Son of the Father. How ironic is that? How fantastic is that? So the one who had the name of Jesus, Son of the Father, was guilty, while the true Jesus, who in reality was the Son of the Father, was not guilty. Now, Pilate now tries to release Jesus because he perceived, in Mark 15, verse 10, he perceived that for envy, the chief priests had delivered him up. Now, both men were brought forward. And just before that choice was brought before the people, Pilate gets a message from his good wife. And this is in Matthew 27, verse 19. "And while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, 'Have nothing to do with that righteous man, because I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him.'" So Pilate gets sufficient warning that he should not act out the role of a judge up to the point of sentencing Jesus to death. And the warning even came now from his own wife, whose name we know, according to church tradition, was Procla, or Claudia Procula. And tradition also says that she actually became a believer. That's what church tradition says. Now, the delay, getting this message was long enough for the chief priests and the elders to stir up the people. However, Pilate now proceeds to give him the choice. And we see in Matthew 27, verse 20, that the chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. In Luke 23, verse 18, we see that they said together, "Away with this man and release unto us Barabbas." And if you ever look in the John 18:40 account, you'll see that Barabbas was described as a robber. But in actual fact, robbery by itself was not punishable by crucifixion. He had committed robbery as a rebel in his activities as a seditionist against Rome, but that was not punishable by death under Roman law. And in Luke 23:19, he brings out the point again. He says, listen, this is Barabbas. He was one who for a certain insurrection made in the city and for murder was cast into prison. So he was cast into prison because of sedition and murder. Now, when this attempt by Pilate fails, Pilate makes his third attempt by trying to quieten the Jews by offering a compromise to them. Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. And that's in John chapter 19, verse 1. Now, scourging was or flogging, if you want to call it flogging, was a very, very cruel form of punishment. And to be scourged was to be beaten or flogged with a whip, with multiple lashes on this whip. And Pilate had a reason for the severity of this flogging. Why? Because he was hoping, what he was hoping to do was to say, look how badly I have scourged Jesus. You know, isn't that punishment enough? Shouldn't you let him go now? So he's hoping that by scourging Jesus, the crowd will say, okay, release Jesus for us. But once again, it doesn't work. Now, under Roman law, I bet about scourging, under Roman law, the number of times a person could be struck with the scourge was limitless. You could just keep beating the person. And this Roman whip had very long lashes which could wrap around the whole body. And the end of each of these lashes was a piece of metal, or you'd find a nail or a piece of glass or some sharp lamb bone. And sometimes even small jagged iron balls were used in these things. And after only a few applications of the scourge, what would happen to the skin of the victim, it would be torn away and the muscle would then be exposed. The entire body was affected by this. The front of him where the whip lashed around, his back, his sides, his face. And in fact, the face would be so lacerated, it would become like pulp. So much so that family members actually wouldn't recognize their family member because they would be unrecognizable after a scourging by the Romans. And in fact, many people had died because of scourging, never living to be crucified. It was not the norm that you would be scourged and then crucified. You would, one or the other it would be. Now, the Jews had rules regarding their lashing, this form of punishment, and the actual stripes or the actual lashes given by the Jews were restricted to 40 save one. That means only 39. Because according to Mosaic law, nobody could be lashed more than 40 times. And we see that in Deuteronomy 25, verse 3. Yeah, the Jewish scourge was made either of leather or wood for the handle and had very short leather lashes, where the only part of the victim beaten was the back. And no one died of a Jewish scourge. In fact, all you do is get, welts in your back. In fact, Paul had 5 of these scourges, 5 of these lashings. Now, in regards to Jesus, that was what we see here with his scourging was a fulfillment of Isaiah 52, 13 to 15, which reads in Isaiah, "Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. As many were astounded at thee, his visage, his looking at him, was so marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So shall he sprinkle many nations, the kings shall shut their mouths at him, for that which had not been told them shall they see, and that which they had not heard shall they consider." So in fulfillment of Isaiah 52, we see that Jesus was so marred that he was unrecognizable. Now we come to the third mockery. And the accusation against Jesus was that he claimed to be a king. And we read this in John chapter 19, verses 2 to 3. The soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple garment. And they came unto him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. So here they're mocking Jesus as the one who proclaims to be the King of the Jews. And simply placing this crown of thorns on his head after his scourging would cause a tremendous amount of pain. But you know what? They kept striking him. They kept striking him on the head where this crown of thorns are. These thorns are very sharp thorns. In fact, you read about them, and if you even brush against them, they'll cut your skin. And so what they're doing is, as this crown of thorns is on his head and they're striking him, they're driving the crown of thorns further and further into his head. But we need to recognize the symbolism here. Jesus has this crown of thorns resting on his head. According to Genesis chapter 3, verses 17 to 19, thorns are a symbol of the curse on Adam and on his descendants. So the picture of Jesus bearing the crown of thorns becomes a symbolic picture of his bearing the curse for sin. So the soldiers struck him with their hands, and now this was the fourth mistreatment Jesus was to suffer on this Passover feast day. In John chapter 19, verse 4, we read, "Behold, I bring him out to you that you may know that I find no crime in him." So Pilate's fourth declaration of innocence, but again, this attempt to have Jesus released failed. This is his third attempt to have Jesus released. It's his fourth declaration of innocence. It's his third attempt to have Jesus released, and it too fails. What's the response of the multitude? The response of the multitude was to demand crucifixion, because we read, "Jesus therefore came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple garment. And Pilate said to them, Behold the man. When therefore the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify him, crucify him." There is no let up here. This now leads to the fourth attempt to have Jesus released by refusing to give the Roman sentence. Remember, Rome has to give the sentence of death here. And we see in John chapter 19, verse 6, Pilate said unto them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no crime in him." So Pilate does not find any crime in Jesus which is worthy of death. So Pilate's fourth attempt is thwarted when the leaders finally produce the real charge against him that's bothering them. In verse 7 of John's account, we read, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." Now, this was the real accusation, not sedition. It wasn't sedition against Rome, but it was Jesus's claim of deity. This is the real accusation against him. Pilate now is a bit shaken, because this is the first time he's heard this. And since Pilate had a new charge, he had to conduct a new interrogation. And we see this in verses 8 to 11 of John chapter 19. So now it leads to Pilate has a second private interview with Jesus, but Jesus would answer no more questions. And there came a point in time when Jesus stopped answering questions and would not answer any further. And Pilate, in his frustration, asked Jesus whether he did not recognize that he had the power to crucify or to release him. And this time, Jesus did make a comment, and it showed who really was in control, because he says, "You would have no power against me, except it were given you from above." That's John 19:11. The power which Pilate had was by divine reckoning. It was a God-given power, because everyone in a position of authority is put there by God. And that's a teaching in the book of Daniel. And Jesus continues in verse 11. "Therefore, he who delivered me unto you has the greater sin." And that was referring to the leadership of Israel, who were guilty of the greater transgression here. And this simply proves to us that there are varying degrees of sin. The great white throne judgment will judge the works of the unbeliever and determine the appropriate degree of punishment in the lake of fire. Now, this now led to Pilate's fifth attempt to have Jesus released. We see in verse 12 of John 19. Upon this, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." Now, the fifth attempt to have Jesus released was also again thwarted by the cries of the multitude. "You are not Caesar's friend." Now, this one statement would intimidate Pilate into submitting to their requests. And in verse 13 we read, "When Pilate therefore heard these words, he brought Jesus out, and he sat down in the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha." The judgment seat here, or the bema seat, was an elevated stand, probably erected outside the Praetorium. And this was where public meetings were directed and courts were held. Now, why should the one expression, "You are not Caesar's friend," shake Pilate like this? If this trial occurred in AD 30, which we actually believe it did occur in AD 30, the cause of the intimidation we don't know. However, if these events occurred later on in AD 33, which is another possible year of this crucifixion, it's possible that he was intimidated because of events occurring in Rome at the time. The reason was that Pilate got his procuratorship through a friend who had authority in Rome. So a mate in Rome, a guy called Sejanus, he was a confidant of Emperor Tiberius, and he was also a captain of the Praetorian Guard. And through his influence, the procuratorship had been given to Pilate. Now, later on, Sejanus decided that the position of the emperor and conspired to assassinate Emperor Tiberius. And everyone who had been connected with Sejanus was under investigation by the Roman Senate. And this was to see if they had any role in the plot formulated by Sejanus. And because of his friendship with Sejanus, Pilate would have been at this time under investigation by Rome. And the last thing which Pilate needed at this time was information getting back to the Senate body that someone claiming to be the king of the Jews, and therefore a competitor to Caesar, had been released by him. So if it was in AD 33, this would have been the reason. And in light of what was happening back in Rome, Pilate sat on the judgment seat, or the bema seat itself. And again, this would only apply if this was AD 33. Then comes his sixth and final attempt to have Jesus released by making the statement, "Behold your king." This is in John 19:14. "Behold your king." And the response of the Jews was in verse 15. Away with him, crucify him." Pilate said, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." And that cry came from the chief priests, the Sadducees, who with this statement disowned the Messiah as their king and proclaimed their allegiance to Caesar. The Pharisees, if they were there, would never have made such a declaration. Not the Pharisees. And in the Matthew 27 verse 24 account, we read here, "So when Pilate saw that he prevailed nothing, but rather that a tumult was arising, he took water and he washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I'm innocent of the blood of this righteous man. See you to it." So here we have the fifth declaration of the innocence of Jesus. And this was the most strategic one, because where did it come from? It came from the judgment seat itself. Although Pilate may have thought that, by washing his hands of the whole affair, he would be innocent, but he was far from innocent, because Pilate alone had the power to sentence anyone to death or to release him. His washing of his hands can under no circumstances alleviate his role in the death of Jesus. He was the one who would pass the death sentence. He would be the one who would assign the Roman soldiers to carry out the crucifixion. The washing of his hands was just a very feeble gesture, nothing more. In actual fact, in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 4, verse 27, his role in the crucifixion of Jesus is stated very clearly by the Apostle Peter. And nor has the church ever forgotten Pilate's role, because among the earliest creeds of Christendom, you have the Apostles' Creed. You know, the Anglican Church and most of the Protestant churches have this, the creed, and it says there, suffered under Pontius Pilate. So Pilate was never forgotten for this. In the year 36 AD, Pontius Pilate was banished to Gaul, which is Vienna in Austria today. And he was banished there by Emperor Caligula, and there he committed suicide. So he did pay for his role in the death of Jesus. Now, in regard to Pilate's claim to be being innocent of the blood of this righteous man, that's what he calls him, this righteous man, Matthew 27:24, which he was not innocent, the leadership of Israel responded in verse 25 of Matthew 27. All the people answered and said, his blood be upon us and upon our children. So they took upon themselves the curse of the blood, limiting it to themselves and their children. It didn't go beyond that. The Jewish people as a whole today cannot be held responsible or accountable for the death of Jesus. And in the year 70 AD, the curse came to fruition because it came upon them and their children. And only Matthew is the one who writes about this. Why? Because he is the apostle that traces the result of the unpardonable sin, which he spoke about in Matthew chapter 12. So at this point, Pilate now issued the death sentence. And we see this in Luke 23:24. Pilate gave sentence that whatever they asked should be done. It was Pilate alone who had the authority to pass sentence, and he did. We read in verse 25 that Barabbas was released. And here was a symbolic substitution. Jesus, the real Son of the Father, would die in the place of the one who is named Jesus, the Son of the Father. The one deserving death, who was Barabbas, would be freed, and the innocent one, Jesus, would die in his place, or in place of him. And the paragraph ends with Matthew 27:26. Jesus, he, Pilate, scourged and delivered to be crucified. Now, Jesus is now turned over to the Roman soldiers, where he suffers the fourth mockery of the night. We see this in Matthew 27, verse 27 to 30, and Mark 15, 16 to 19. In Mark 15, verse 17, then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered unto him the whole band. This is Matthew 27. In Greek, the word band actually means cohort, and this was the 400 plus soldiers that was released to Judas. It now gets together again for the crucifixion. After stripping of his clothes, they put a scarlet robe upon him, Matthew 27:28. And here they're mocking his royalty. Instead of a crown of gold, they placed a crown of thorns on his head, Matthew 27:29. And a reed in his right hand. And the reed is simply there to mimic a scepter, a royal scepter. And after spitting on him, in Matthew verse 30, they took the reed out of his hand and used it to strike him on the head. And remember, he has a crown of thorns on his head. So they are striking the crown of thorns with this reed. So this is the fifth mistreatment he suffered on that night. Now we go to the death of Jesus. We're going to Calvary, and the best way to chronologically trace the sequence of events of Jesus' crucifixion is to number them stage by stage. And from the time he began his procession to Calvary until the tomb was sealed, there are 32 distinct stages. And the procession to Calvary has the first 5. And we see these in Matthew 27, 31 to 34, Mark 15, 20 to 23, Luke 23, 26 to 33, and John 19, verse 7. Standard Roman procedure for the condemned was to carry his own cross to the site of his crucifixion. And normally, they were forced to carry only the cross beam. And their outstretched arms were tied to it. And John here describes, in John 19:17, he says, he went out bearing the cross for himself. So this would have been the cross beam. He was carrying the cross beam. But remember, Jesus had been scourged terribly, and it left him in such a weakened state so that he couldn't carry this crossbeam very far. You're going to need help. And so that's the first stage. In the second stage, Simon of Cyrene is taken out of the crowd and he's compelled to assist Jesus with the weight of the cross. And this we see in Mark 15:21. And they compel one passing by, Simon of Cyrene, coming from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to go with them that he might bear his cross. Simon was a Jew from North Africa who came to Jerusalem to observe Passover. And the first day of Passover, when the special Passover sacrifice was offered, many Jews came into the city to observe this special sacrifice. And coming in from the countryside into the city, he found himself compelled to bear a cross for a condemned man. Matthew and Luke report this, but Mark points out that he was the father of Alexander and Rufus, so obviously his family was known. Remember that Mark wrote his gospel for the Romans. And in Paul's epistle to the Romans, in Romans chapter 16, verse 13, Rufus is mentioned. So he was then a believer in Rome, and the other Roman believers would have known him. It could very well have been Simon's son. Remember, we saw here, there was, in this incident, we had Alexander and Rufus. So this incident here quite possibly led to the conversion of Simon, his 2 sons, Alexander and Rufus, and his wife, who is mentioned in Romans chapter 16, verse 13, by Paul as the mother of Rufus. Now, it was typical for those who were condemned, carrying their cross, that they would be yelling and screaming and swearing obscenities or curses at their executioners. That was the norm. You know, you're venting your spleen against everybody around you. And sometimes the swearings were so bad that soldiers actually cut out the tongues of the people, the condemned people, just to keep them quiet. Jesus didn't yell, he didn't scream, he didn't curse. He went quietly. Instead, what he did was he prayed for his executioners. As Simon observed this scene, he might have actually come to the conclusion that Jesus was actually who he professed to be. And that possibly could have led to his salvation and the salvation of the rest of his family. Possibility. The third stage that we see now, so that's the second stage with Simon carrying the cross. The third stage is Jesus' lament over Jerusalem. And we see this in Luke 27, verse 27 to 31. There followed him a great multitude of the people and of the women who bewailed and lamented him. But Jesus, turning unto them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming in which they shall say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never gave suck. Then they shall bring to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things in the green tree, what shall be done in the dry? Now, these women were not the women who followed Jesus. These women were the professional wailers and lamenters, and they come now following this procession. And he stopped the procession and he turned to them and he told those inhabitants of Jerusalem, "Don't weep for me, guys. You need to weep for yourselves and your children." Why? Because remember back in the previous paragraph, they'd taken this curse upon themselves. His blood be upon us and upon our children. So now this judgment would fall upon them and upon their children, and this would be the judgment of 70 AD. Jesus then made a statement understandable only from a Jewish perspective. He says, "For if they do these things in the green tree, what shall be done in the dry?" And we see this in Luke 23:31. This was what is called a Calvary argument, which was based upon Ezekiel 20 verse 47. It means you go from light to heavy. What he's saying here is this: if I suffer this much and I am innocent, how much more are you going to suffer who are guilty? The saying is that the green wood is difficult to kindle, while the dry is easy to burn. If the life of the pious Jesus ends with a tragedy, what's going to happen to sinful Jerusalem? That's what he's saying. What's going to happen to them? Well, we know from history what happened in AD 70. We now have the arrival at Golgotha, which we see in Mark 15:22. And they bring him onto the place called Golgotha, which is being interpreted the place of a skull. So we now arrive there. This is the place of crucifixion. Golgotha is simply an Aramaic word for skull. Calvary is the Latin word. Now, nowhere in the text does it actually say it looks like a skull. That's not what it looks like. It simply was the place of a skull, which simply means that it was the place of execution, specifically by crucifixion. And this fits well with what we know of Jewish and Roman customs, which demanded that executions had to take place outside the camp or city walls. So this is the fourth stage. The fifth stage is they now offer him wine mingled with myrrh, but he received it not. We see that in Mark 15:23. And Matthew added that the drink was also mingled with gall. And that's in Matthew 27:34. And this was a stupefying drink for the purpose of numbing the pain of being nailed to the cross. It's also made one lightheaded or even unconscious. But Jesus refused it because he needs to have total control of his senses for what must happen, because the spiritual warfare he's about to fight on the cross. So what he does is he rejects this mixture, and he suffered the full effects of the pain of crucifixion. There's no numbing the pain here. The next three paragraphs are going to deal with the crucifixion. And here, in this paragraph 177, we see the first 3 hours on the cross, which is the wrath of men. And we see this in Matthew 27:35-44, Mark 15:24-32, Luke 23:33-43, and John 19:18-27. Now, the date was in the Jewish calendar 15th of Nisan, and in our calendar April the 7th, 30 AD. It was Friday morning, Passover morning. And during the first 3 hours on the cross, Jesus now suffers the wrath of man. And these were the hours from 9 o'clock until midday. And the wrath of man encompasses the 6th through the 17th stages of his suffering. Chronologically, the 6th stage is the actual crucifixion at 9 a.m. at the 3rd hour. And this is happening at the same time with the sacrifice of the Passover lamb, the chagigar, which we spoke about last week, on the Temple Mount by the chief priests, which they will then partake of together later on. So while Jesus is being nailed to the cross, the Passover sacrifice, the chagigar, is being slain. All right, so crucifixion, we spoke about, was the harshest form of capital punishment in the ancient world. And in Greece and Rome, it was initially only used to execute slaves. But the Roman Empire started to kill its own citizens this way, simply to instill fear, especially in those who were scheming sedition. And so the thought of crucifixion was meant to frighten you into not taking part in any sedition. We see this in the Mark account, where it simply says, and they crucify him. Now we know that there are 4 types of Roman cross, 4 types. What we see here, the first type was a pole, similar to like a telephone pole, not as smooth as a telephone pole. And this was the crux simplex. It was a simple cross. And the hands of the victim were crisscrossed and then nailed to the pole above the head. So a bit like that. The second type was the crux, what they call the cusata, which is like an X, Roman numeral X. That's where it gets its name from. According to church tradition, Peter was crucified upside down on this X type of cross. The pole and the X type were generally not used outside of Italy. They tended to be only used in Italy. Third type was the crux commissa, meaning the connected cross, and it was shaped like the Greek letter tau. It's like an uppercase T. It's commonly referred to the tau cross. And then the fourth type was the crux emissa, meaning the inserted cross. And this looks like a lowercase t. Capital T, in the capital T, the sign was placed above the person. Sorry, the capital T sign under the person, lowercase t, the sign was placed above the person. Now, the first and second types of crosses were generally only used in Italy. We spoke about it before. However, there are exceptions to the rule. So we can't completely rule these crosses out. If the only other options were the third and fourth types of crosses, then the most likely choice is the fourth type. Because during the crucifixion procedure, a piece of parchment or wood known as a titulus, it would display the reason the person was being executed, and it would be nailed somewhere on the cross. And on the tau cross, it was placed underneath the feet, and on the lowercase t cross, placed over the head. And Matthew clearly stated that the sign displaying Jesus' name and crime was placed over his head. So if the only choice is between the third and fourth types, it was clearly the fourth type. But we also know that the placard was also placed over the pole type of cross, as well. But we don't know whether Jesus' hands were crossed over. The text doesn't tell us that. However, it does say that he carried his cross, so he would have carried the beam. So it's more than likely the lowercase t cross, because remember, Pilate also put over his head in 3 languages, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." So what would happen would be the cross was laid on the ground and the victim was nailed there on the ground. And Jesus was nailed not through the palms, because the palms, it's not strong enough to hold the body. If you'd nail through the palms, you would just pull off. So it would be through the small bones in the wrist, and that would have supported his weight. If it was a T cross, which we think it is, 3 nails, you have 1 for each wrist, 1 for the feet. And the feet would have been overlapped with the nail coming through the heels. Very painful, very, very painful. And on a small platform or a ledge would have been fixed just below the feet. And after the nailing, the cross would then have been lifted up, and it would have been dropped into a hole prepared for that cross. And because of the way the body would be jarred up and dropping into the hole, the bones of the body would be pulled out of joint. And this would fulfill the prophecy of Psalm 22, verse 14. "I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint." So the time it would take for a victim to die would be from hours to days. In actual fact, they were given liquids to drink, but no food. Why? Because they felt compassion in giving them liquid to drink. On the biblical and Jewish law, there was a special curse for those who were executed and then hung on a tree. And once death occurred, the body had to be removed from the tree and buried by sundown. And this is part of the Mosaic law in Deuteronomy 21, verse 22 to 23. Now, stage 7, we now see the first words from the cross. And Jesus will actually speak 7 times from the cross. And these are his first words. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. We see this in Luke 23, verse 34. So Jesus prayed for the forgiveness of those involved in his crucifixion. But the prayer of forgiveness was limited to those who did it in ignorance, for those who did not know what they were doing. His prayer would exclude Pilate, Judas, Annas, Caiaphas, among others. But it did include the Romans and many other Jewish leaders. And the factor for those who are still in ignorance is brought out again in Acts chapter 3, verse 17 by Peter and Paul in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 8. Now remember, at the same time as the crucifixion and the Temple Mount complex, the Passover or the Paschal lamb was now sacrificed by the high priest and the chief priests. The 8th stage is the parting of his garments, and we see this account in John chapter 19, 23 to 24. The soldiers, therefore, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, to every soldier a part. And also the coat. Now the coat was without seam, woven from the top throughout. They said, therefore, one to another, let us not rend it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be. That the scriptures might be fulfilled, which say, they parted my garments among them, and upon my vesture they cast lots. These things the soldiers did. Now, Jewish garments were usually comprised of 5 parts. There was the outer garment, the second, the undergarment, and third was the head covering, fourth, the shoes, and fifth, there was a robe or a coat. And there were always 4 soldiers detailed to carry out a crucifixion, and there were 5 garments. So one took the outer garment, the next the undergarment, the next was the head covering, and fourthly the shoes. Now regarding the robe, it would not be torn into 4 parts because his coat was a very expensive robe. Normally it would be worn by members of the upper classes. Instead, what they did was they chose to cast lots for it. It was probably given to him by, remember his ministry was financed by wealthy women, so it was probably given to him as a gift by one of those wealthy women. Now, little would these Roman soldiers know that they're actually fulfilling prophecy by casting lots for his garment. And we see this again, a fulfillment of Psalm 22, verse 18. Now, superscript, this is stage 9. We have a superscription fixed above the head of Jesus on the cross, and it reads like this: this is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And it was written in 3 different languages: Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And in normal circumstances, what was fastened on the wood above the head of the crucified one was a description of the crime for which he was being executed. But by Pilate's wording of it, it didn't sound like an accusation. It actually was rather a title. And the Jewish leaders recognized this, and they requested Pilate to change the wording. Listen, don't put that wording there. We don't like that wording. And so what did Pilate do? He refused to do that. The chief priests wanted him to change it to read, write not the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am King of the Jews. And we see that from John 19:21. And this was Pilate's own personal revenge upon the Jewish leaders, the chief priests, the Sadducean members of the Sanhedrin. Why? Because they forced his hand on this issue, and they made him do something which he didn't wish to do. So he left it like that. And interestingly here, the judge who found no guilt in Jesus, which is Pilate, and cynically stated what is truth, he has just set forth the truth about Jesus here. Jesus is the King of the Jews. And so when he said, what is truth? He didn't know what he was talking about. And now he's written it above his head. And we see the crucifixion of two other men, one either side of him. And we see this in Matthew 27, verse 38. Then they're crucified with him two robbers, one on the right hand, one on the left. Robbers, remember, you don't get crucified for being robbers. The Greek would have been better translated rebels instead of robbers. Again, fulfillment of Isaiah 53:12. And these guys here were probably being crucified because they probably would have been part of Barabbas's insurrection. Fifth mockery was done by those passing by, which we see in Mark's account in Mark 15:29-30. They that passed by railed on him, wagging their heads and saying, Ha! Thou that destroyest the temple and buildest it in 3 days, save thyself and come down from the cross. And again, fulfillment of Psalm 22:7-8. The site of the crucifixion is by a gate through which people are going into Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. So it's outside the gate. They're all walking past the main road. And they knew that the original accusation against him was disrespect for the temple. And they now are mocking Jesus for that. The sixth mockery we see was cried out by the leaders of Israel. And we see here that this is described in the Mark account, Mark 15:31-32. In like manner also, the chief priests, mocking him among themselves with the scribes, said, He saved others, himself he cannot save. So this means here where it says the chief priests, they're the Sadducees, the scribes are the Pharisees. So now we have both the Pharisees and the Sadducees mocking him while he was on the cross. The seventh mockery, which is stage 13, and now this mockery was carried on by the Roman soldiers, and those whom Jesus had just prayed forgiveness for. And we see this in the Luke account, verses 36-37. And the soldiers also mocked him, coming to him, offering him vinegar and saying, If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself. So what we see here is that both the Jews and the Gentiles were guilty of scoffing at Jesus while he was on the cross. Notice that they were saying to him, come down from the cross. I mean, if he'd come down from the cross, Satan would have won. Jesus had to die on the cross. Coming down from the cross to prove his messiahship would have been a failure on his part. That is the lot for this week. There are contact details there if you need to contact us.